Millionaires don't always know what's best for their kids, and these 5 cases of millionaire parents forcing their kids to climb Everest proves it. One of them dragged his son up the mountain to win a custody case. Another had Sherpa teams warning each other about him before he even landed in Nepal. I'm Matthew. This is Dark Ascent, and trust me, every one of these gets worse than the last. The custody filing landed in an Arizona courtroom in January of 2016. Warren Kessler, 46, a real estate developer out of Scottsdale, was fighting for primary custody of his 16-year-old son, Liam. His ex-wife's lawyers had built a portrait of an absent father, a man who always looked more comfortable closing deals than showing up to school events. Warren thought Everest would shut all of that down. He wasn't planning to wave it around in court or anything, but it's the kind of thing that's pretty hard to argue against. A father-son summit of the highest mountain on Earth, a mountain that, despite being one of the highest peaks already, continues to grow about 4 millimeters higher every year. Warren definitely had the money. That was never the problem. 20 years in commercial real estate meant $90,000 for an expedition barely registered. What he didn't have was a willing son. Liam was 16, one of the youngest climbers on the permit, and he told his mother before Nepal that he didn't want to go. Warren found out through his lawyer and turned it into a parental alienation claim. That came up early in my research, and it set the tone for everything. The kid said he didn't want to climb, and his dad used it against her in court. Liam wasn't the anxious type. He was just kinda more absent. He'd climbed Rainier and Elbrus with guides, and the feedback both times was basically identical. The kid never asked a single question about where they were going or what conditions looked like. From what it looks like, he just followed along, and that was it. On Elbrus, his guide noted that Liam ate every meal alone, just watching videos on his phone, rather than joining the group. Though honestly, he didn't seem antisocial. His mind was just somewhere else. The expedition company assigned Nima Wangdi to Liam specifically. Nima was 41, with 9 Everest summits behind him. The kind of Sherpa who could read a client's headspace from the way they adjusted a strap. He saw the problem inside the first week. During rotations up to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, Liam moved when told, stopped when told, ate when told. Never once checked his own gear. Nima brought this to the expedition leader. The leader brought it to Warren, and Warren apparently responded and said that the kid was just low-key and it was nothing to worry about. Then came the phone call. Rest day at Camp 2, May 2016. Warren rang his lawyer on the sat phone, not realizing how thin the mess tent walls were, so half the camp ended up hearing everything. Court date moved up. Needs summit photos before June. And after that call, you could just tell something shifted in him. Like the climb wasn't really a climb anymore. It was just a deadline with snow on it. On May 17th, summit night, they left the South Col at around 11:45 p.m. and fell into the line of headlamps heading up the mountain. -20 Fahrenheit, wind ripping sideways across the slopes. Liam kept pace through the lower sections. Same mechanical obedience as every rotation before. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, something had definitely switched off. If you didn't know, the balcony is basically a small flat area on the southeast ridge where climbers swap oxygen bottles and take stock of their condition. At that altitude, you're breathing air with roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. His pace dropped by half. It wasn't full haste, not yet, but the combination of hypoxia and whatever was happening in his head had thinned his cognition to almost nothing. He was still walking on his own, still clipping in and out, but his eyes were dead flat. You could tell he stopped being present in any way that mattered. Other climbers passing them on the fixed ropes later said it looked like he was sleepwalking. Nima told Warren to turn the team around. Warren refused. When Nima keyed his handset to radio the expedition leader, there was a long pause. The leader asked about Liam's vitals, asked whether he was showing physical symptoms. Warren took the handset and told the leader his son was fine, just tired. The leader told Nima to prioritize the turnaround time and use his judgment if things deteriorated, but stopped short of ordering them down. That's the part of these stories that sits with me the worst. The guide has the training, the experience, the judgment, and the system is built so that none of that matters when the money talks louder. They hit the summit at 11:20 a.m., and Liam was barely even there at that point. Warren spent like 20 minutes taking photos from every angle, holding up some banner his lawyer had apparently suggested, and Nima kept telling him they needed to go down, but Warren just kept messing with the camera, and honestly, that part just frustrated me to no end. The descent fell apart fast. Liam couldn't coordinate his crampons on the down climbing. Every step required Nima to physically position his feet and wait while Liam processed instructions with a delay that stretched longer each time, and other teams passed them going down. Nobody stopped beyond a glance. It isn't out of cruelty, but at that altitude, you don't stop for someone else's problem unless you want to become part of it. Oxygen ran low for both Kesslers. Nima started switching Liam onto his own oxygen supply intermittently, sharing his mask in controlled intervals. Every swap meant pulling mitts off with bare fingers to manage the connection, and each time he exposed his hands, the frostbite risk climbed. Bare skin at -20 Fahrenheit with wind can develop frostbite in under 5 minutes. Nima was doing this repeatedly over the course of hours. 3 people, not enough oxygen for 2, descending at a pace that would put them on the upper mountain after dark. Warren was the first to go down. The signs had been building for a while. Bad coordination, slow responses, none of his decisions making any sense. Basically textbook haste creeping in. By the time they were above the south summit around 28,500 feet, it had gotten bad. He sat down in the snow and that was it, and Liam just stopped right next to him. That part honestly broke me a little because the kid had been operating on his father's commands the whole expedition, and the second those commands stopped, he just shut down too. Not because his body failed, but because no one ever taught him that his own decisions were worth anything. Nima couldn't move both of them. There was just no way at that altitude. He stayed as long as he could until his own oxygen was basically gone, and then had to descend alone. He made it back to Camp 4 after dark, both hands badly frostbitten from having to pull his outer mitts off over and over to manage equipment during those last hours. Neither Warren nor Liam was seen alive again. Their location on the upper mountain was documented, but recovery was deemed too dangerous. They remain on Everest. Nima lost 3 fingers. His career on the high mountains was finished. The custody case was formally dismissed after both were declared deceased. Liam's mother told a reporter months later that she'd spent the whole spring trying to stop it through channels that moved too slowly. One father's agenda, one kid who never learned to say no. The next story has 2 fathers with the same problem, and a coincidence that made everything worse. Nobody planned for Graham Ashworth and Renzo Marchetti to be on Everest at the same time. They'd co-founded an investment fund 7 years earlier, and the partnership had burned down in a lawsuit that took 2 years to settle. Unsurprisingly, they hadn't spoken since. Graham was 51, British, hedge fund money. His son Callum was 19, a rugby player with Kilimanjaro and Mont Blanc under his belt. Renzo was 49, Italian-American, private equity. His son Nico was 20 and, unlike him, actually knew what he was doing on mountains. His resume consisted of Aconcagua, Denali, technical routes in the Dolomites. Both fathers had booked the same expedition company for the spring 2017 season without knowing the other was on the list. They found out on the same afternoon at base camp. The politeness was surgical. No scenes, no confrontations. Just 2 men who couldn't be in the same mess tent without the temperature dropping. Other climbers on the expedition later said Graham would physically reposition himself in the dining tent if Renzo sat within 3 seats of him, and Renzo started timing his meals to avoid overlap. Their sons, who had no part in the business fallout, ended up getting along during acclimatization rotations. That made both fathers visibly uncomfortable. Just wanted to quickly say, if you enjoy deep dive documentaries on mountaineering, hit subscribe because we frequently post videos like this. Now let's get back to the climb. Kancha Bode, 36, got assigned to the Ashworths. 6 summits under his belt, quiet by nature, but sharp enough to read a room. He figured out the rivalry before anyone even told him about it. During the second rotation to Camp 2, Graham pushed his pace hard enough that climbers way behind him could hear him gasping for air, and the only reason was because Renzo's team had left like 20 minutes earlier. I've talked about ego-driven climbs a lot on this channel, but when you have 2 egos feeding off each other, it's a whole different situation. They weren't climbing against the mountain anymore, they were climbing against each other, and neither one of them was ever going to be the first to stop. Summit push, May 21st. Both families in the same line going up from the South Col. Traffic on the fixed ropes slowed everyone down, climbers bunching up at narrow sections. Graham watching Renzo's headlamp above, Renzo refusing to slow down, knowing Graham was below. 2 turnaround times, both held hostage by the other man's position. The split happened at the south summit, 28,700 feet. Nico stepped into his father's path and wouldn't move, no yelling. He just planted himself and made it physical. Renzo pushed back, gestured at the summit, and eventually gave in. They turned around. Nico saved both their lives with a decision that took maybe 90 seconds max. Callum tried to do the same thing with Graham. It didn't work, not because he didn't mean it, but because the relationship was built differently. Nico had spent years climbing on his own terms and had the standing to override his father. Callum had always climbed on his father's schedule with his father's money, at his father's direction. However, you can't expect to have that kind of power in a single conversation at 28,000 feet. That's what stayed with me. Callum tried. He saw what Nico did and he tried to copy it, but the foundation wasn't there. Graham and Callum summited at 2:15 p.m., well past turnaround. Then the weather started to turn. A jet stream shift arrived earlier than expected. The wind picked up first, then visibility started closing in over the next hour until the upper mountain was gone. Graham's HACE symptoms surfaced during the descent: confusion, stumbling, and inability to follow the fixed ropes right in front of him. Callum tried to guide him through it, but trying to navigate terrain you can barely see with a father who can't even think. A single thought is a problem that doesn't have an answer. They went off route somewhere above the south summit. Callum found a rock outcrop and got them both clipped to an abandoned fixed line from a previous season. It blocked enough wind to make the difference between dying in the first hour and lasting until dawn. He still had some oxygen left in his bottle, running at a low flow, and that kept him on the right side of conscious. Survival rates for an unplanned bivouac above 8,000 meters are almost non-existent. The fact that Callum had even partial oxygen and a windbreak is likely the only reason he was still breathing when they found him. He spent the night going in and out, forcing himself awake each time to talk to his father. Graham answered at first. The answers got less coherent as the hours went on. Around 3 in the morning, they stopped altogether. Graham's breathing went uneven, then shallow, then quiet. A Sherpa team found Callum the next morning, still clipped in next to his father. Conscious but wrecked, he survived. He lost both feet below the ankle. Kanchabode had been feeling tightness in his chest since the summit push, but pushed through during the rescue coordination until his breathing deteriorated badly. HAPE. He was flown to Kathmandu. He recovered from the fluid in his lungs, but the panic attacks that followed didn't go away. He quit guiding and took a job running a lodge in the Khumbu. Now, before I move on to the next story, you should know that there's a weather briefing that happens on Everest every spring, where expedition leaders sit down with forecast data and pick their windows. In May of 2018, the models suggested a window around the 16th through the 18th. The consensus was clear: go early or risk bad weather. Martin Freed heard the briefing and ignored the part that mattered. Martin was 52, tech money out of Austin, and he'd spent 2 years planning one specific moment: his son Aiden standing on top of Everest on May 19th, the kid's 18th birthday. He'd had a banner made, GoPros configured for the summit shot. The whole narrative was locked in. Aiden was the real climber in the family. 18. Denali and Aconcagua already behind him, strong on technical terrain, good instincts. He kept a detailed climbing journal and logged every training session for 2 years leading up to Everest. His gear was his own, bought with money he'd saved from part-time work, not his father's credit card. He told his father they should go when the window was open. Martin said no. The birthday was the point. This one hit differently for me than the others. Martin wasn't cruel. He wasn't selfish the way Warren Kessler was. He just loved his kid and wanted to give him something extraordinary. But Everest doesn't grade on intention. It grades on timing. Chairing Namgyal, their Sherpa, 33 with 5 summits, backed Aiden up through the expedition leader. Martin held firm. Most teams sent their climbers up on the 17th and 18th. By the evening of the 18th, the wind was already picking up and clouds were stacking to the west. Martin and Aiden left the South Col late on the 18th, aiming for a birthday summit. They pushed into conditions that were already worsening. Wind above the balcony built steadily through the night, gusting past 60 miles per hour by the time they reached 28,000 feet. For your context, sustained winds above 50 miles per hour on the upper mountain are considered enough to knock a grown adult off their feet, especially on exposed ridgelines where there's nothing to grab. Visibility was dropping and temperature was getting worse. They got to about 28,200 feet before cheering stopped them. Aiden agreed instantly. Martin pushed back 900 feet from the top. So close. Aiden stood his ground and said he was going down, with or without him. Martin, faced with his son descending alone, finally changed his mind. Coming down broke Martin. He slipped on a steep section below the balcony, fell about 15 feet before the fixed rope caught him, and the impact left him with a severe ankle fracture. At 27,000 feet in that wind, a broken ankle is a death sentence in slow motion. Cheering and Aiden got on either side of him and tried to bring him down, but they were losing daylight, losing warmth, and and covering ground so slowly that the mountain was gaining on them. Martin died from exposure sometime in the early hours of May 19th. The cold took him the way it takes everyone at that altitude. Shivering that stops, confusion that deepens, a stillness that sets in and doesn't lift. His son's 18th birthday, Aiden and Cheering, barely made it back to Camp 4 at dawn. Aiden lost several toes to frostbite. He went back to climbing 2 years later, but he's never gone near Everest. Cheering finished the season, then told his company he wouldn't take clients who overruled weather calls. They couldn't promise him that, so he walked away from high-altitude work entirely. When Elena Keene was dying of ovarian cancer in a Boston hospital in late 2012, she asked her husband Douglas to scatter her ashes from the summit of Everest. Elena had never climbed anything. The request was about something bigger than a mountain. She wanted to exist at the highest point on Earth after her body couldn't carry her anywhere anymore. Douglas took that wish and turned it into a mission. He was 50, a pharmaceutical executive, and he had the resources to make it happen. He hired a coach, trained for over a year, and booked a spring 2014 expedition. Scattering ashes on Everest's summit is more common than most people think. Dozens of climbers have carried remains of loved ones to the top over the years, and some expedition companies even list it as a service option. He was going to carry Elena to the top of the world. But the bigger problem was that he also brought their daughter along. Fiona Keene was 21. She'd done Kilimanjaro on a guided trip and some trekking in the Alps. That was the extent of her experience with altitude. She wasn't on Everest because she wanted to be. She was there because saying no to her dead mother's wish felt like a second abandonment. Grief had made the unreasonable feel mandatory. I've turned that over in my head more times than I'd like to admit. A kid agreeing to do something terrifying because refusing feels like betraying a person who's already gone. There's no clean way out of that. Saying yes is dangerous and saying no feels unforgivable. Lakpa Jangbu, 29, 4 summits, was assigned to Fiona. He saw what was happening right away. The forced smiles, the going through the motions compliance, the way she looked at the upper mountain like it was a debt collector. Notice how she was the only client on the expedition who never once took a photo above base camp. Everyone else was documenting everything. Fiona didn't even unzip her camera bag. He flagged it. Douglas thanked the expedition leader for the concern and said Fiona was just nervous. At Camp 2, Fiona told Lakpa she didn't want to go any higher. She was terrified and grieving and couldn't understand why her father didn't see that scattering ashes on a summit wouldn't bring her mother back. Lakpa passed this up the chain. Douglas sat with Fiona afterward, and other climbers saw the conversation but couldn't hear it. She agreed to continue. They both made it to the South Col and launched for the summit on the night of May 18th. Fiona climbed in what Lakpa later described as autopilot, moving, clipping, following directions, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Lakpa stayed close enough to grab her if he needed to. Traffic above the south summit put about 40 minutes between them. Douglas got there first, scattered the ashes, and just kind of disappeared into the moment. By the time Fiona arrived, he didn't even notice how bad she was. Over 20 minutes on the summit before he realized something was wrong. The most human, most understandable delay in any of these 5 stories, and it'll be the most expensive. The descent went wrong at the Hillary Step, where the death zone was located. It was a place where oxygen was just so thin, even for elite climbers. Fiona clipped in wrong and slipped 6 feet before the rope caught her. Broken wrist and bruised ribs. Not life-threatening, but any injury at that altitude is basically a ticking time bomb. Lakpa splinted her wrist and started walking her down one careful step at a time. Progress measured in single digits of feet per minute. Douglas, descending behind them, had been above 27,000 feet for far too long. His breathing got worse over the next hour. Wet cough, then pink spit, then a gurgling quality to every breath. Pulmonary edema building in real time. He collapsed around 27,200 feet, still conscious for a few minutes, but unable to stand. Lakpa tried to get Douglas up, pulled his arm, braced against the slope. He couldn't stand. Lakpa stayed longer than he should have, but Fiona was still alive and moving, so he took her down to the South Col. Douglas stayed on the mountain with Elena. Fiona healed physically. Lakpa tried one more season the next year, but turned around at Camp 3 and couldn't go higher. He moved to Pokhara and started guiding treks on the Annapurna circuit. Pokhara sits at about 2,700 feet, right on Phua Lake, with views of the Annapurna Range across the water. It's where a lot of retired high-altitude workers end up, close enough to the mountains to still feel connected, but low enough that the air doesn't ask anything of you. Easier terrain and lower stakes. It was the kind of altitude where leaving someone behind isn't part of the job description. Before Victor Brandt ever showed up at Everest Base Camp in the spring of 2013, the Sherpas already knew his name. 3 years earlier, on Manaslu, Victor had blown past his turnaround time and kept climbing. Manaslu is the 8th highest mountain in the world at 26,781 feet, and at the time, it had a fatality rate that made even experienced Himalayan climbers cautious. His Sherpa guide went with him, because that's what the job required. The late descent cost that Sherpa 2 toes and his ability to ever work at altitude again. Frustratingly though, in a later interview, Victor called it an unfortunate situation that comes with the territory of the work he was in. Never named the Sherpa, never paid the medical bills. What got to me wasn't the negligence though, it was how he told the story publicly and narrated another man's career ending like it was nothing. You can't blame that on altitude. That's just who he was. The story was already spreading like wildfire through Sherpa groups and base camp conversations. By the time Victor arrived at Everest with his 18-year-old son Henrik, every Sherpa on the mountain knew what he was. Henrik didn't know any of it. He was athletic, trained hard for a year, eager to make his father proud. He'd never been above 20,000 feet. During the approach trek, other climbers noticed Henrik would always wait for the porters to pass before continuing on narrow trail sections, stepping aside and nodding as they went by. Small thing, but it stood out because his father never did. He had no idea what his dad had done on Manaslu, or what his last name meant to the people carrying his gear. Furba Sonam took the assignment knowing all of this. Furba was 39, 8 Everest summits, one of the most experienced guides working the south side. The Sherpa who lost his toes on Manaslu was someone Furba had trained with years ago. He took the Brandt contract anyway, because his daughter needed spinal surgery and the fee covered it. That's the math these guys live with. Your kid's health on one side, a client who already wrecked one Sherpa's career on the other. To no one's surprise, Victor ran exactly the way the warnings predicted. Dismissed briefings, changed schedules without telling anyone. Henrik was nothing like that, however. He was pretty polite, genuinely curious, always asking Furba real questions about the mountain and actually listening when he answered. Furba started caring about this kid more than the job required. Summit push, May 19th. Leader called turnaround at 1 p.m. At 12:45, Victor was about 200 feet below the top and he heard the call and just completely ignored it. Told Furba it was 20 more minutes to the summit. Furba said they needed to descend and Victor just didn't respond, didn't even look at him. Just kept moving. Henrik followed behind him, and you might think why, but that's just because that's what kids do when their father keeps walking without looking back. They hit the summit at 1:35 p.m. and only stayed a few minutes. But at that point, it doesn't really matter because every minute past turnaround up there is oxygen you're burning, daylight you're losing, and body heat that's just not coming back. On the traverse above the south summit, Henrik slipped on some mixed rock and ice. It was a short fall, maybe 8 feet, but the rope between him and Victor yanked Victor sideways, and Furba below them on the fixed line ended up absorbing the full weight of both of them. The force just completely destroyed his shoulder, partial dislocation, nerve damage, grip strength on that whole side completely gone. After that, there's just no turning back from an injury like this, especially in this line of work. 1 good arm, 2 clients, fading light. The one thing working in their favor was that Henrik had decent footwork from his training, solid enough that verbal coaching could bridge the gap. Furba talked him down through the hard sections, calling out foot placements from memory. Victor, rattled by the fall and finally willing to listen, descended on his own but slowly. Too slowly. Dark caught them above the South Col. Henrik made it to Camp 4 after nightfall with Furba's voice guiding him the last stretch. Victor was behind them, alone on the final section. He collapsed about 300 feet above the tents. You could see the lights from where he fell. 300 feet is nothing at sea level, but at 26,000 feet. In the dark, with nothing left in the tank, 300 feet is the distance between being alive and being a story someone tells on a channel like this one. Victor Brandt died overnight, close enough to safety that it almost doesn't make sense. Henrik found out about Manaslu later, reading through climbing forums. He never talked about his father publicly after that. Furba's shoulder never came back right. The nerve damage was permanent. 2 expeditions connected to the same man. 2 careers ended. His daughter got the surgery, paid for through the expedition company's insurance. 5 fathers and 5 totally different reasons for being up there. A custody battle, a rivalry, a birthday promise, a dead wife's last wish, and a guy who just kept making the same mistake, and not one of them turned around when they had the chance. Every one of them had someone telling them to stop, and every one of them chose the summit over the person standing next to them. I've honestly spent a long time with these stories at this point, so I can say for certain that every single one of these fathers would have said they did it for their kid. And every single time, when the mountain forced a choice, the kid lost.